What are some of your concerns? What are you seeing in Cuba that has you concerned?
I'm concerned about the trend, and the trend is towards growing government restrictions on religious groups, on faith communities in Cuba. And this is really quite disturbing. We're seeing increasing imprisonment, intimidation of religious leaders, of Protestant pastors. We're seeing the narrowing of scope for religious activity on the island. And this is a negative trend. One might have hoped, following sort of the end of the Castro regime, that there would be some shift, but there's been no shift. And we think back to the papal visit to Cuba many years ago. There was a sense of opening up. This is when Fidel Castro was still around. There's a sense of sort of opening up towards certainly the Catholic Church. But now, again, we're seeing a tightening, and the trend is not positive. What also concerns me is the fact that Cuba gets a bit of a pass, it seems, from various countries in the hemisphere. Certainly, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, in their latest report, 2023, just recently released, cites Cuba as being a fairly systematic persecutor of different religious communities through government restrictions, and calling for it to be named a country of particular concern under the U.S. system of designation for countries that are violating religious freedom, which calls for greater sanctions against Cuba, the blocking of assets for Cuban people in the Cuban leadership that are responsible for this sort of systemic persecution, such as the leader of the Office of Religious Affairs in Havana. So I would like to see a greater sort of intent on the part of the Canadian government and in other governments in this hemisphere to speak out against religious persecution in Cuba, because, again, the trend is negative and we need to really speak out. And the Cuban government, I think, does listen when countries in the hemisphere target it for these types of violations.
Well, let's discuss that for a moment. There are those who would argue for a more isolationist approach that, well, why should we be the global religious freedom police? Why does Canada have to play a role in that? Why do you feel it's important that Canada do step up to the plate, that Canada does step up to the plate and help preserve and promote religious liberty globally?
Well, I think it comes down to a fundamental question. Do we believe that religious freedom is an objective and universal truth? Do we believe that this is an objective and universal human right? And certainly the various international human rights covenants that we have signed on to, as have many other countries, such as the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, highlights that religious freedom has this status. It's a very important human right. So it's one thing to work through the UN system, to work multilaterally, through large international organizations to speak out about religious freedom. But I have always favored a more bilateral approach where we need to go and speak to these governments directly and to call them out for government restrictions or not managing social hostilities between different religious communities well. And some would argue, well, who are we as Canada or who is the United States to go and do this? Well, because we believe in democracy. And because we believe in a pluralism in which religious pluralism is important. And so I think we do have the authority. Now, are we perfect in Canada? No, we're not. And we talked about that at the top of our time today. But I think we do need to have that voice with other like-minded countries to call, especially totalitarian states, to order for their violation of religious freedom. And we shouldn't be ashamed of that. We should do it certainly without equivocating. But also we need to be mindful of how we need to defend religious freedom and champion it in our own backyard.
Okay, we only have 20 seconds left. What can we as individuals, I don't work for government, many of our viewers obviously don't. What can we as individuals do to protect religious freedom?
First of all, educate yourself about what religious freedom is. Understand how religious freedom comprises not just the freedom to worship, but many other aspects of our religious lives. A very good thing to read would be the recent pastoral letter by the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops on religious freedom. It's an excellent way to better understand what religious freedom is. Speak to your MP, speak to your MPPs or your MLAs, talk about religious freedom, why it's important for a deep pluralism in Canada, for a truly diverse country. and how religious freedom needs to be both a public reality, not simply a private reality.